Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me tonight for a fabulous story. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was strange arriving in the small rural Montana town that was wearing an antique cloak of yesteryear, as if not much had changed over the centuries. Although some of the vintage-looking shops hinted at a peppering of modern touches that persuaded Gemma that perhaps the town had moved forwards into modern times after all, with a reticent, wary reluctance, like a mule plodding along, carrying a heavy weight on its back, and not being desperately enthusiastic to move forwards. It was almost as if every wooden or stone building was completely set in its ways, like some of the older, cranky residents of this town, many who understandably really didn't fancy doing things differently, or embracing change that was too dramatic for them to stomach. Some clearly looked on the persuasion of modern influences with a sceptical, rather cautious suspicion. The town was postcard perfect, and as pretty as a picture, in a rustic town and country sort of way. There was no doubt about that, as large keg barrels were tumbling over with vibrant red and pink hanging geraniums, as colour splashed itself magnanimously around the town, announcing to anybody that would notice or listen that summer had at long last arrived, and the general spirited ambience suggested many had heeded its call, as residents abandoned their parkas and winter sweaters like the skins of an old onion, and were thoroughly enjoying the sun's golden promises. Gemma was so grateful for that, for she'd never been the type of person that enjoyed cold weather. In another lifetime she'd obviously been a salamander. If she could have her way, she'd lie contentedly in the sun, like a cat soaking in the warm sunshine, on a sun lounger all day long, if given the chance or opportunity. But these days the tanned look was out of fashion, and invited you the promise of skin cancer and early onset aging, two things that Gemma would like to avoid like the plague. Winter in New York had not been a pleasant experience, especially after her father's fortuitous tragic passing that she'd never ever seen coming. Her dad's death had certainly hit her hard, like a bolt out of the blue, or a random chance encounter with a lightning strike. It would seem the frigidly cold, inauspicious, austere days of winter had been foreboding, grey, incredibly depressing. So the bright blue Montana skies, with the complementary viridescent rolling countryside, had been a welcoming sight for Gemma when she'd arrived in the small town. But she sensed she'd likely feel like a fish out of water around these parts, and she wasn't altogether sure how she'd be perceived by the locals. Ostensibly, Gemma had never really concerned herself about the opinions of others. Was not life tough enough already, without worrying about things that you certainly could not change? Gemma was not sure she'd be welcome in this quaint Montana town, where people were acquainted with each other's shadows and knew what their neighbour was wearing to church the previous Sunday. There was no doubt in her mind that new faces were probably regarded with grave suspicion. So a strange woman asking uncomfortable, awkward questions about a curious missing persons case that had happened in the 1980s was possibly going to go down like a lead balloon here. People did not like mysterious small-town secrets being unearthed by nosy intruders, putting their nose into a case that was as cold as the ice in Antarctica. When Gemma had by chance stumbled across an old newspaper article, her curiosity had been piqued, and she was eager to find answers to a plethora of questions that had plagued her of late, because indirectly those questions concerned her, in a manner of speaking. It was only after her father's sudden death, which had thrown the world as she knew it precariously off its axis, so she felt she'd lost all sense of her bearings, rather like a migratory bird, no longer remembering its flying route, or being able to pick up the Earth's magnetic signals to navigate its migratory path clearly. Gemma felt equally as unhinged and disconnected to everything, for losing the only remaining member of her family had left her dreadfully alone in the world, as if she was abandoned on a desert island, and now was going to have to fend all for herself, and face the challenges that came her way single-handedly. It was good to have friends, of course, and Gemma had 3 very good friends, but blood was thicker than water, and without her only surviving blood relative around, the rosy glow of security and safety that had surrounded her life for as long as she could remember had dissipated after her dad's death, just like the smoke from a chimney. She knew without him around she'd never, ever feel the same again, for a small part of her was now broken. It was a pity that some injuries could never be physically fixed, for they were the emotional abrasions of the heart that were not so quick to heal, and Gemma was certain that she'd never get over her dad's grievous loss. She missed him so dreadfully. She couldn't understand why other people's parents seemed to live long lifetimes, but her family on both sides seemed to have been strategically pinpointed for an early exit from this planet, and she couldn't understand why. Sometimes life seemed grossly unfair, but her father would always remind her that in everything there will always be a divine justice, but that never brought Gemma much comfort. As for one thing, she didn't know what her father had meant at the time. She thought he was implying that if someone gets 6 Smarties in life, and someone gets 2, in the end things would balance out. Gemma had never grown up with a mother that she could remember, because the first year of your life is not something a baby should ever recall. Gemma's father had told her when she was old enough to understand that her mother had died tragically in a car accident, and that was all she had known about her mother, Samantha Bowen, whom everyone called Sammy for short. It had been devastating to learn that a year after she'd been born, her mother had exited this planet and was now gone for good like a piece of chaff floating away on the wind. It would seem her father had been so annoyingly vague about the details concerning her mother's death. So Gemma had made many assumptions concerning her mother, many of them false, because that's what you do when you try to fill in all the blanks. It was natural for a young girl to want to know all there was to know about her birth mother, the mystery woman who had brought her into the world. Gemma's father had never been forthcoming with any information, especially when it concerned the subject of her mother's death, which was a subject he chose to be very evasive about. "How did she die?" Gemma would ask him when she was a little girl, her ears burning to hear anything her father had to say about the mysterious woman she had yearned to know. She would stare into her father's big brown eyes, not unlike her own, and observe her face reflected in his steely gaze. Mr. Bowen rigidly kept himself to himself, loathing nothing more than people intruding on his personal space and privacy. Even his daughter asking him intrusive questions he did not wish to answer was a bone of contention for the man. Mr. Bowen would frown, the corner of his lips turning downwards, and there'd be a sorrowful glint in his eyes that would pull at Gemma's heartstrings. But she had to ask her dad these questions, or otherwise she'd look on her mother as a blank canvas in her life that could never be filled. "Gemma, I don't know how many times we've gone over this. You've asked me this question 100 times over, and I keep giving you the same answer. I told you that your mother was tragically killed in a car accident. Her car slammed into a tree. She was driving with a friend. Her friend was driving the car. Now let's change the subject, shall we? Death is not a subject we should be focusing on. It's the here and now that matters. It's not healthy. Let us talk about brighter things, shall we not?" "But what was Mummy like, Daddy?" Gemma would ask. "Was she pretty?" Her father would sigh, rub his chin reflectively, in a self-soothing gesture that he would always adopt when he was feeling a tad uncomfortable. "There is a lot more to a person, my dear, than just being pretty," he would say. For a moment there'd be a wistful, faraway look in his eyes, and Gemma could tell that her mother had been the quintessential love of his life. That nostalgic look of longing said it all. "Of course your mother was pretty," he would say, "but she was much, much, much more than a pretty face. She had the grace of a gazelle, the inquisitiveness of a squirrel, and the heart of a lion." And that was all her father would reveal to Gemma about her mother. But Gemma knew that there was no greater compliment than that. What could be better than having the grace of a gazelle and the heart of a lion? But the inquisitiveness of a squirrel was a trait that she too had surely inherited from her mother, and she wasn't certain that this was such a blessing, as Gemma liked to inquire about absolutely everything, if given the chance and opportunity. Growing up as a young girl, she was always the kid in the classroom, raising her arm up enthusiastically to ask question after question. "But miss," she'd say, "if geese really do only have one partner for life, what happens when their mate dies?" She would challenge the teachers with questions they sometimes could not answer. "I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question for you, Gemma, because like every human being on this planet, even animals are uniquely different with their own personalities, and I'm quite sure they all react to life very differently. Some geese might die of a broken heart. I'm sure that must happen. I've seen it in animals in nature all the time. It's not impossible. Others might live on their own and carry on till the rest of their lives. And maybe some find a new mate. But by nature they are loyal to one partner for their entire lives. And we would do well to learn from their example. There are far too many divorces in America. We need to stick by each other in marriage. And the goose might teach us a lot from that." When Gemma was 8, her father married a woman called Estelle Wagner, who moved into their apartment in Manhattan for about 8 years, where she'd become like a mother to Gemma. Her father had met Estelle at the library, when returning overdue library books, and Estelle, who had been a head librarian, had waived all his fines. "I tell you what, Mr. Barton, you can take me out for a drink sometime, and I won't charge you for overdue fees for your late books. Have we got a deal or not?" Mr. Barton had smiled warmly at her. "Sounds like a jolly good idea to me," he said. "How can I possibly refuse that? I know an excellent place where we can go. They make particularly good pina coladas there, and they do a mean, juicy burger." Estelle had raised a quizzical brow. "Sounds like I'm getting a very good deal myself there," she said. "If you're including a meal in the offer, then how can I refuse such a tempting opportunity?" That had been the beginning of the couple's budding romantic relationship, and before long Gemma's father had introduced Estelle to her. Estelle was a shrewd woman, who had always been attracted to Mr. Barton since he had visited the library in Manhattan. One of her good friends working at the library had told Estelle to ask Mr. Barton on a date. "If you don't," she warned her friend, "that ship will pass you by in the night, and the only thing you will ever feel is regret. You need to be like an assertive cat that pounces on its prey. Mr. Barton is the kind of man you need to chase after yourself, and if you don't, somebody else will do it for you, and they'll get the prize, and you'll lose out. So if you want my advice, you go and ask him for a date." Estelle needed little encouragement, and had used the late overdue library books as an excuse to start dating Mr. Barton. She had been so incredibly successful in her endeavours that 12 months later they had been married, and Gemma had welcomed her stepmother in her home, despite all her friends warning her that stepmothers could be very evil. "In all the fairy tales that you read about, they always warn about the wicked stepmother." But Estelle had been anything but a wicked stepmother. On the contrary, Estelle had brought those much-needed feminine touches into their lives, and had turned her father's man cave into a sumptuous, cosy, beautiful home, and beyond that had been a devoted stepmother to Gemma. It had been wonderful going shopping with Estelle to buy pretty things from the store, going to the beach with her when they went away, and to talk to about girls' things. She had someone always to confide in. One day Gemma came home from school to find Estelle in tears. She had never seen the woman in such a state before, and was mortified to see Estelle was piling her suitcases with clothes. The woman wasn't even looking at what she was doing. She was blinded by her own tears, and randomly flinging her stuff into suitcases as if she couldn't leave the apartment fast enough. She looked incredibly distressed, and Gemma's heart broke for her, because she knew that something was terribly wrong, and this was the kind of wrong she sensed could never be righted. "Where are you going, Estelle? Why are you packing your suitcases like that? You're not leaving us. Please, don't tell me you're leaving us. You can't leave us," she had asked, her heart heavy with trepidation. for she could discern that Estelle was obviously leaving them. And she knew with Estelle gone, she'd be left with a huge hole in her life that could never be filled, as Estelle had been a good mother to her over the last 8 years. "What does it look like, Gemma? I'm leaving for good, I'm afraid. I really don't want to do this to you, of all people, because I love you dearly. You're very special to me, and I don't want to hurt you. But I've got no choice in the matter, if I want to preserve my dignity, that is. Leaving your father is the right thing to do. You have no idea, Gemma, what it is like to be compared with a dead woman every day of my life. Your father always describes your mother as having the heart of a lion and the grace of a gazelle. I've never known him to speak so tenderly about me, the way he speaks of your late mother. Do you know, not even once has he ever told me he loves me, not once. Do you have any idea how that feels? It's just so devastating, Gemma. I've waited 8 years for 3 words to come out of his mouth, and no such luck. Your father has never uttered them even once. He's never even told me he appreciates me, Gemma. Do you know how soul-destroying that is? My dad has never ever told you he loves you, and you've been together with him for 8 years. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? No, I'm not, Gemma, I'm afraid. It is true. I don't know what to say, Estelle. I'm so sorry. But you know what my father's like. I do know what he's like. I've been with him for 8 years. I think I should know. I feel as if I'd been hammering away at a hardened coconut for years and years, and never cracking it open to get to the sweet coconut milk. I really thought I'd be able to open him up, you know, Gemma. I cannot believe I was such a dreadful fool. I thought I'd get through to the man hiding beneath the reticent, insouciant veneer that he shows to the rest of the world. But how wrong I was about that. I thought I'd be the one that would get through to him, open up his heart, help him to love again. Your father has been a closed book all his life. And I've had enough, Gemma. I've had enough. I need more in a relationship than your father is willing to give. Someone who's prepared to love me for myself, to make me feel beautiful and valued and important. But your father doesn't appreciate that I need these things in my life. And in a relationship with your father, I've begun to feel vacuously empty inside, as if I'm just a fly on the wall that he barely notices and would probably like to squat if given the chance. Did you not tell him how you feel? Gemma asked. I mean, if it makes you feel any better, Daddy doesn't tell me very often that he loves me either. But I unequivocally know he does, and that he would do absolutely anything for me. And I'm sure the same can be said for you. He probably thinks, based on the kind things that he does for us, that he's showing us love without using words to articulate his feelings. That's probably what this is all about. Of course I told him, Gemma, exactly how I felt. I told him he'd never told me he loves me. Do you know what he said to me, Gemma? Gemma drew in a deep breath. What did he say? She asked, although she didn't want to hear what Estelle was going to say next. Your father told me he's always liked me, that he was terribly fond of me, and that we're very good friends. After 8 years, Gemma, he's only fond of me. When he told me that, I was furiously angry. I wanted to slap him across the face. After all I've done for him, he's only fond of me. Fond of me. I mean, isn't that a joke? I'd laugh if it wasn't so crazy. He said that to you? Said Gemma. He just told you he liked you and was fond of you, and that you were good friends. That's crazy. You've been living together for the last 8 years. I'm sure he loves you, Estelle, but I know he's got a funny way of showing it. Although you know what he's like, he's not exactly the kind of man who wears his heart on his sleeve. My father is complicated, hard to figure out at the best of times. I've struggled to understand him my entire life. I should know. That's the problem, Gemma. I don't think your father will ever acknowledge he loves me, and I need him to do that. I can't live in a marriage where I'm not made to feel appreciated and cherished. I'm sure you can understand how I feel. And I know he's not going to change, Gemma. And I'm sorry after 8 years I'd like a husband to say that he actually loves me. Is that too much to ask, Gemma? Do you think I'm being unreasonable? She said, blowing her straight, pert little nose into a large man-sized tissue and using her thumbs to wipe away a couple of stray tears rolling down her cheeks. Of course you're not being unreasonable, said Gemma. I'm angry with my father for treating you like this, Estelle. Sometimes I can't figure him out. You're the best thing that has ever happened in our lives, and I don't say that lightly. I mean it. Before you came along, we were eating baked beans and miserable burnt offerings and ordering takeout every second day. And when you arrived in our lives like a rainbow from heaven, our lives took on a positive turn with home-cooked delicious meals, exciting camping holidays, incredible shopping trips, and then there's all you've done to the house to make it a real home for us. If you go, life is going to be so dull. Gemma pulled a face. Please, Estelle, please, please, please don't go, she said obsequiously. Dad and I really need you. Besides, you do love him, don't you? That's the problem, Gemma. I love you and your dad more than anything else in the world. Then why don't you stay, Estelle? I don't want you to go, said Gemma, breaking into tears and grabbing Estelle for dear life, as if afraid to let her go. My mum left me, Estelle, when I was little, when I was only 1 year old. And now you want to go. Why does everyone I love leave me? It's not fair. That's the problem, Gemma. That's one thing I've learnt. Life isn't fair. It never is. And we have to learn to accept that. She took the teenager into her arms, that she considered like a beloved daughter to her, cupping her head in her hands. Now you listen to me, Gemma, and you listen good. I'm leaving your father, but I am not leaving you. I am never, and I mean never, leaving you. In my eyes, you are my daughter. The fact that you aren't my daughter by blood is neither here nor there. It's the same to me. In my eyes, you are 100% my little girl, and I will remain involved in your life as if I have never left you. Do you understand? Nothing in that regard will ever change. I'll be living under another roof. I'm actually moving in with my sister. She's never married and could do well with the companionship, so it's going to work out fine for us. And you can visit as often as you like. We're literally a 5-minute walk away from here. You need to appreciate, Gemma dear, that I'm not prepared to play second fiddle a moment longer to your late mother. It's a joke, it is, and I'm sure you understand that. Your father puts your late mother on a pedestal, as if she could do nothing wrong, as if she's some kind of angelic entity that has never sinned in her entire life, which is ridiculous because she is as human as the rest of us. Well, she was when she was alive. It's her picture he's kept in her wallet all these years, never mine. I think that's telling enough, don't you? You deserve better, Estelle. You are right, Gemma admitted. The two women had held each other tightly and wept. You'll always be my little girl, Gemma, Estelle had said. I'm your mother, don't you ever forget that, and you're my daughter. So if you need something, I will be down the road from you, and you can call me 1,000 times a day if you like. I won't mind at all. In fact, I will be delighted to hear from you. I'll always have time for you, Gemma dear. When Estelle had left their family home, she'd filed for divorce, and it had been tough and hard going for Gemma, but she soon adjusted to the change in their living arrangements. She'd meet up with Estelle 3 days a week, and regularly walk to Estelle's sister's apartment for a chat, and sometimes stay overnight at the apartment. And Estelle had made her up a perfectly beautiful bedroom. It would seem her father prodded along nonchalantly with life, as if nothing had happened, as if the dramatic change in their lifestyle and circumstances was simply water off a duck's back to him. He didn't seem desperately upset or aggrieved that Estelle had left their lives, and his insouciance and apathetic indifference had made Gemma absolutely furious. "What is wrong with you, Dad?" she said one evening over the dinner table, as she ferreted around the Chinese takeaway box to retrieve a helping of chicken chow mein, which she deposited on a cold plate. And now, with no one preparing meals for them, they were living on takeout. She was unable to contain her indignance. She threw down her chopsticks onto the table, glaring defiantly at her father like an angry cat that was about to lash out at him with her razor-sharp claws. "Look how we're living now, Dad, without Estelle around. We're living like absolute pigs. Your clothes are everywhere, over every single floor, over all the furniture. Our kitchen looks like a bomb has hit it. And I'm expected to do all the cleaning because you refused to lift a finger. Why did you not tell Estelle you loved her, Dad? Then we'd be one happy family together. What's wrong with you? Why are you so emotionally redundant? It was so good having Estelle around. She was a brilliant mother to me and a fabulous wife to you, and I don't think you saw that. You couldn't have had a more devoted woman at your side, and yet you never appreciated everything she did for you and for us. She loved us both so much. I feel as if our lives have come crumbling down with the forceful ferocity of a wrecking ball. All Estelle needed from you was love, Dad, and for you to express it a little from time to time. But was that too hard for you, to give her what she needed? Estelle was good to us, Dad. I'm surprised you did not see that. She was the mother I never had, and she made my life richer for knowing her. And you've thrown all that away because you're so proud, far too proud to tell her you love her. You know what, Dad? You make me sick to my stomach. I'm ashamed to call you my father. It was abuse the way you treated her. Abuse, nothing less and nothing more. You know not telling her you love her is that. It's abuse. I'm sorry to say it, but that's how I feel. Estelle deserved so much better than you. How could you have been so heartless, so cruel, so cold, so indifferent?
Gemma, you make some very good points there, and I'm sorry to have upset you. And it grieves me that I couldn't give Estelle what she needed emotionally. But I've never been in love with the woman. Would you really want me to lie to her? To tell her what she wants to hear? I respect her too much for that, and in my opinion that would be treacherous. I was fond of Estelle, a very good woman she was. We were great companions when we got married. I thought she didn't want to be alone. A lot of people don't want to be lonely after they've lost a spouse. So they get reacquainted with somebody else, and both of them come together. In friendship they do, so that they don't have to be alone. And that was the idea. That is the reason I got together with Estelle. But she wanted so much more from me than I was prepared to give. I couldn't give my heart to her completely. It belonged to another. She could never have replaced your mother. Your mother I loved unconditionally. My heart is reserved for her and for you. That's the way it'll always be. Estelle was a good friend. She was there for me as a friend. That's how I saw it. You see, from the first day I met your mother, Gemma, I knew she was the one. There is no one out there that could take her place. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I think you're like a goose, Dad, Gemma had said.
Gemma's father had raised a brow. A goose? What are you talking about, Gemma? Sometimes you speak in riddles. It's impossible to understand what you're trying to say.
Gemma grinned. We discussed it in class once when I was at school years ago. I think it was Mrs. Wallace's class, if I'm right. Do you know geese are faithful to one partner for life?
Well, there you go then, said her father, giving his daughter a bashful smile. I'm a goose, and I'm proud of it. It's better to be a goose than a rabbit, don't you think? Rabbits are notorious for getting frisky with so many partners, as many as possible. Me, I'm loyal to a T. And I can't help myself, but that's the way I am, and I'm not ashamed of it at all.
Of course it's better to be a goose, said Gemma. I hope the man I marry one day will be a goose, faithful to me alone. But I wouldn't like to be with a goose that's loved his previous partner and overlooked me, like you did with Estelle. That would be a real bummer. I understand why Estelle left you. I really do. I hope you don't mind my saying that.
You're right, Gemma. It's a good job she did. She needed way better than I was prepared to give her, and I hope she gets it. I mean, we would have been happy together if she just wanted to remain friends and go about the things the way we always did. But she wanted so much more from me. So I hope she meets someone who can give her the love she deserves. She's a good woman."
Gemma realised from her father's revelatory comments that no other woman would ever be able to fill her mother's shoes, as far as her dad was concerned. And that was the way it would always be. She needed to accept that her dad was devotedly loyal, like an old English sheepdog hanging around its owner's grave long after its owner has died. And even though it might be rehomed and even adopted, it'll never be able to replace its original owner, its first love. That was the way it was for Gemma's father. She had kept a picture of her mother by her bedside table, and would lovingly stroke her mother's face from time to time, and talk tenderly to the unresponsive, fixed photograph. "What were you like, Mama?" she would ask the picture. "I wish I knew you. I wish I'd known you in my life. I so wish you hadn't gone away from us. I wish you had been my mother." But the girl in the picture with the shoulder-length chestnut brown hair and hazel eyes would not respond, but only smiled brightly back into the photograph, holding in her arms an adorable black Scottish terrier that Gemma learnt was called Bobo. The photograph did not speak back to her. It did not answer the questions she longed to ask. For years, over the course of her young life, she had regularly visited a grave site at the cemetery, where her father would one day be buried with her mother. But it was after his death that she learnt that her mother's body had never been buried in that double burial plot that her father had purchased. The grave she had visited as a girl, where she had laid flowers for so long, had in fact been empty all the time. And the granite large gravestone that had been erected was a memorial to her mother. It left her wondering what had become of her mother's remains. But then she realised maybe her mother had been cremated and requested a burial site for himself, and a double plot at that. That part made no sense to Gemma at all. So there we are, that's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.